Keep going, little fella. That's it, almost there. He's slipping. Grab the saddle, I've got him.
The river was a brown wall of rushing water, and the donkey was seconds away from being pulled under. Everyone on the bank said it was too late. But Jack didn't listen. He kicked off his boots and dove into the freezing current. What happened when they finally reached the shore is why this tough cowboy couldn't stop the tears from falling. The sun was just starting to peek over the jagged hills of the high desert. It was the kind of morning where the world felt new and clean. Jack sat on his porch, holding a tin cup of hot black coffee. He was an old man now, with skin like worn leather and hands that had spent 50 years pulling ropes and branding cattle. People in town called him a hard man. He did not talk much, and he never smiled just for the sake of being polite. He liked the quiet of the ranch because the animals never asked him for anything he could not give. The spring melt had been heavy this year. High up in the mountains, the deep snow was turning into water and rushing down into the valley. The creek that usually trickled behind the barn had turned into a wide, brown river. It was loud and angry, carrying broken branches and thick mud from the hills. Jack could hear the roar of the water from his front door. It sounded like a freight train that never stopped moving. "Better check the south fence," Jack muttered to himself. He stood up, his knees popping like dry twigs. He whistled for his old dog, but the dog just wagged its tail and stayed on the porch. The air was cool, but the sun felt warm on his neck as he started his walk. He walked along the edge of the rising water. The ground was soft and sucked at his heavy leather boots. He was looking for gaps in the wire where the debris might have pushed through. Everything seemed fine until he reached the bend where the river turned sharp toward the canyon. Above the sound of the rushing water, he heard something else. It was a high, thin sound. It was the kind of sound an animal makes when it knows it is in trouble. Jack stopped walking and tilted his head. He heard it again. It was a long, shaky bray. He ran toward the bank, his heart starting to thump against his ribs. Down in the churning water, stuck against a pile of tangled logs, was a small gray donkey. The water was already up to its chest, and the current was pulling its legs out from under it. The donkey was looking straight at the shore, its large ears pinned back against its head. Its eyes were wide and white with fear. Jack stood on the muddy bank and looked at the raging river. He was a good swimmer, but he was not young anymore. The water looked cold and deadly. But when the donkey let out another desperate cry, Jack felt a sharp tug in his chest. He could not just stand there and watch it go under. The water did not look like water anymore. It looked like a thick, brown soup of mud and broken trees. It moved with a terrifying speed, crashing against the rocks and spinning in heavy circles. Every few seconds, a large log would shoot past, bobbing up and down like a cork. Jack stood on the crumbling edge of the bank and looked at the small donkey. The animal was pinned against a massive fallen cottonwood tree that had jammed into the mud in the middle of the river. The donkey was struggling to keep its nose above the surface. Its breath was coming in quick, wet gasps. Every time a wave hit the log, the donkey would slip a little further into the dark current. It looked small and helpless against the power of the mountain melt. "Hey, Jack, get back from there." Jack turned his head. Two younger ranch hands, Billy and Sam, were galloping up on their horses. They skidded to a stop near the bank, their eyes wide as they looked at the flooded creek. "That bank is going to give way, Jack," Billy shouted over the roar of the water. "Look at that mess. There is no way to get to that animal. It is a goner." Sam nodded, his face tight with pity. "It is just a stray donkey, Jack. Probably wandered down from the high hills looking for grass and got caught. You cannot go in there. That water will pull you under before you take 3 strokes. It is a lost cause." Jack did not answer. He looked back at the donkey. At that exact moment, the donkey turned its head. It looked right at Jack. There was no sound this time, just a steady, silent stare. It was the look of a living thing that knew the end was coming but was still hoping for a hand to reach out. Jack felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the wind. He remembered all the years he had spent being tough and walking away from things that were too much trouble. He thought about how many times he had told himself that nature was just cruel. But looking into those dark, frightened eyes, he knew he could not be that man today. "I am not leaving him," Jack said. His voice was quiet, but it was firm. "Jack, don't be a fool!" Billy yelled. Jack did not listen. He sat down on the muddy grass and pulled off his heavy leather boots. He tossed his hat to the side. He took a deep breath of the damp air and stepped toward the swirling edge. The water was freezing, hitting his skin like 1,000 tiny needles, but he did not stop. He lunged forward and dived into the heart of the brown river. The moment Jack's body hit the water, the air left his lungs. It was not just cold, it was crushing. The river felt like a heavy, moving wall trying to flatten him against the rocks. He kicked his legs hard, fighting to keep his head above the brown foam. Every time he took a breath, he tasted grit and muddy salt. The current spun him around, dragging him toward a cluster of sharp branches, but he reached out and grabbed a solid limb of the fallen cottonwood tree. The wood was slick and slimy under his hands. He pulled himself along the trunk, inch by inch, while the river hissed around him. The donkey was only 5 feet away now. The animal saw him coming and began to thrash its legs, its hooves striking the water in a blind panic. "Easy now," Jack choked out, his voice nearly lost in the roar. "I am right here. Don't you kick me now, or we both go down." He reached the end of the log and wrapped one arm around the donkey's neck. The animal was shaking so hard Jack could feel the vibrations in his own bones. He could feel the donkey's heart racing like a trapped bird. The water was pressing the animal tight against the wood, and the weight of the river was pinning its legs. Jack reached into his belt and pulled out a short piece of rope he had tucked there at the last second. He looped it under the donkey's chest, working blindly under the dark water. His fingers were numb, feeling like thick wooden pegs, but he forced them to move. He tied a knot that he knew would hold even under the heaviest pressure. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the canyon. It sounded like a gunshot. The giant cottonwood tree was starting to snap. The roots that had been holding it to the mud were giving way. "Jack, get out of there! The log is moving!" Billy screamed from the shore. Jack looked downstream. Just 50 yards away, the river dropped over a jagged ledge of rocks into a deep, churning pool. If the log went over that ledge, they would both be crushed underneath it. He didn't have time to think. He grabbed the donkey's mane with both hands and waited for a big surge of water. When a heavy wave lifted them both, Jack gave a mighty shove. He used every bit of strength left in his old muscles to push the donkey toward the shallow side of the bend. They tumbled into the open water together just as the massive tree ripped free and shot downstream like an arrow. Jack felt a sharp pain in his shoulder as a branch clipped him, but he did not let go. He kicked toward the muddy bank, dragging the donkey with him, until his knees finally hit the soft silt of the shore. Jack pulled himself onto the muddy bank, his lungs burning and his body shaking from the cold. The donkey collapsed beside him, its coat soaked and heavy with river silt. For a long minute, neither of them moved. Then, the small animal crawled closer and rested its heavy head directly on Jack's chest. It let out a long, shaky sigh and closed its eyes, finally safe. Jack looked at those long ears and felt the animal's heartbeat against his own. The tough cowboy reached out, wrapped his arms around the donkey's neck, and sobbed. He cried for the life he saved and for the wall around his own heart that had finally broken. The storm eventually passed, leaving the ranch quiet and the river back in its banks. But things on the ranch were different now. Jack didn't return the donkey to the hills, and he didn't send him to an auction. He named the little gray animal Lucky. Every morning, when Jack stepped out onto the porch with his coffee, Lucky was there waiting by the gate. The donkey didn't act like a wild animal anymore. He followed Jack everywhere, from the tool shed to the far pastures, walking right at his hip like a loyal dog. The other ranch hands watched in silence as the tough old cowboy began to carry extra apples in his pockets and speak in a softer, kinder voice. The fear that once filled Lucky's eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, steady trust. Jack realized that by saving the donkey from the river, he had actually saved himself from a life of hardness and solitude. He wasn't just a man who worked with cattle anymore. He was a man with a friend.